Resuming debate, the honourable member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to stand up here and talk about Bill C-71, something that's very important in my riding and something that I spoke to a number of times. But before I get into the history and some of it, you know, I got so many of my good colleagues around here, and especially those colleagues from Quebec. And did you know, Mr. Speaker, that we added to those numbers tonight up in Chicoutimi? I'm looking forward to another one coming here. And you know, in that Chicoutimi area, Mr. Speaker, over the years, I used to buy cattle up in that area, but also I used to hunt and fish up in that area. And I can tell you that there's no doubt in my mind that bills like C-71 is one of the reasons that Mr. Martel, apparently one of the most famous hockey coaches in Quebec, got elected tonight with a huge majority. And the reason that I mention that, Mr. Speaker, is Canadians everywhere, whether they're in Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound, they're in the Yukon, or they're in Chicoutimi in Quebec, they're ordinary Canadians who hate to be told that you're a criminal just because you like to hunt or you farm and you have a rifle, a .22. As a farmer in my other life and what have you, Mr. Speaker, every farmer in this country, whether he hunts or not, most of them have a firearm. And it's for that rabid fox that gets in with his livestock, a coyote that's trying to take down a newborn calf, or a bear trying to do the same thing. Or, as my member from Prince Albert mentioned, intruders that come on trying to steal stuff, you know, out of your shop, out of your yard, whatever. It's commonplace in rural Canada that people have firearms. And, you know, there's a quote here that was earlier that I just shake my head at, the member from Oakville, North Burlington. She made this comment, Mr. Speaker. Firearms owners are law-abiding until they aren't. Wow. What in the heck does that supposed to mean? Like, I just shake my head. I have a lot of respect for that member who sits on the Public Safety Committee, but if that isn't something, you know, aiming a dart at a large, law-abiding group of people in this country, I don't know what is. And I'm ticked off by it. I'm offended by it, and I know that a lot of people across this country are. So to get into some of the history about why C-71 came out, Mr. Speaker, is this government said, we're going to do something about gang violence, we're going to do something about the illegal firearms trade. Where is it? There isn't one thing. I've talked to a number of members across the way, Mr. Speaker, in private, and they know. They admit there's nothing in here. This is a virtue signaling to a group of people who are absolutely against firearms for various reasons, or they're against hunting, they're against whatever. But the bottom line, their ultimate goal is to get rid of firearms everywhere and not to recognize a right that, you know, there's lots of people out there who know how to handle them. Speaker, I've had a gun in my hand for since I was 8 or 9 years old. But I was taught by my father how to do it safely. My boys was all 12. That's when the legal hunting age was. And my boys all got their license at 12. But I taught them how to handle a firearms owner. The same as I taught them how to ride a bike, do whatever. But you teach respect along with that. It isn't just about learning how to operate it. It's the same as running farm equipment, and I know the member from Melpeck sitting across there grew up on a farm. He farmed, and I know that he would have taken his kids and taught them the same way. And whether it's a piece of farm equipment or a firearm or whatever else, you teach the proper way to handle it and the way to treat it with respect and what have you, and everything is good. Now, one comment that, now before I get into that comment, I just want to talk about, I sat in a Public Safety Committee just a few weeks ago, and I'll tell you, some of the testimony that I heard that day would blow your mind. no pun intended. And what came out of this C-71 is the government fudged the numbers. The crime rate with firearms has been dropping since the mid-60s. That's common knowledge. But in 2013, they really dropped. So what did the government across the way, Mr. Speaker, do? They used that as the base number, knowing that no way are you going to get in 2014 the same drastic drop in firearms crime, and it went up a bit. And all of a sudden, my God, the sky is falling. You know, everybody's shooting everybody everywhere, and that's not the case. And, you know, when you start fudging numbers like that, 2 witnesses there that day out of 3 both said along the same line. So something, the reason I mention that is because then I get a member from Kenora that gets up here tonight. And and I'll tell you, I've hunted and fished in his riding. I have a lot of friends up there. And I'm sure they're going to be happy after his comment tonight. And quote, amongst firearms owners, there is a lot of mental health issues. Well, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, there sure as heck isn't in my family and the friends and the people that I know that do it, that hunt and handle firearms. And that's a pretty blanket statement. I can't believe, I don't know if he meant to say it, but I think in previous, when asked in a question, he pretty well repeated it, so I kind of think he meant it. That kind of thing is not helpful. It's not correct. Sure, there's the examples all the time, but the one thing I think that's really worth pointing out in this is when he talks about some of this mental health, he started off by talking about the U.S. The U.S. has a way worse record and a way worse problem with firearms down there than we do in Canada. And you want to know why, Mr. Speaker? Because we got the toughest laws in the world. We've had the toughest handgun laws in the world since the 30s, and we're keeping up well ahead with long guns and what have you. We all know the history in 1995. In fact, one of the things that motivated me to get into federal politics was that long gun registry. And I can still hear my dad, 86, still hunts, and he was made to feel like a criminal so much. My father-in-law was the same way. God bless his soul, has passed away. He was going to bury his guns rather than register them, and he didn't want to break the law. And that just shows you the kind of thing that when you attack law-abiding firearms owners, I'll tell you, they get upset. They want to fight back. They shove back. And I'll tell you, this attack, this most recent attack on here, you fudge the numbers, you try and pretend that we got the same crime problem or gun problem as they do in the United States. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I got 2 minutes left. When you start comparing us with the U.S., you're going down a road that you shouldn't ever head down. It's like apples and oranges. You just can't do it. The U.S. has problems because they don't have the same kind of laws that we have up here. And now I talked about the crime rates dropping. Firearms Advisory Committee. And I got my good friend here that sits ahead of us. She spoke here just a few minutes ago from Calgary. And, you know, I had a long conversation with her about this about a year ago. And she actually had a bit of a personal issue with firearms. And she finally realized that I don't understand them. I don't know what it is. And she said, I have a lot of people who hunt in my riding. So what did she do, Mr. Speaker? Probably the smartest thing any politician could do. She actually went out and got a pal because she wanted to see, well, everybody says it's so easy to get a gun and get a license and do all this. She went out and did it all, and it took her over a year. And there's nothing wrong with that. We're not complaining, but it just goes to show you that there's all kinds of rules put in place there. And if more members went out and did what that member from Calgary did, we'd be a lot better off. And the last thing I'm going to say before I take questions, the Firearms Advisory Committee. Every member that sits on that committee should have went out and did what the member from Calgary did and got a pal so they actually know how the system works, what have you, instead of bringing their bias in there and what have you. And with that, I'll take questions.
Questions. Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Social Development.
I'd like to ask through the chair to the honourable member across the way. I was at an event last night in my riding. It was a wedding. It was a very beautiful night. But one of the saddest moments was a mother who walked in who a month ago, as her son was taking out the garbage at 11 o'clock at night in downtown Toronto, he was shot. He was shot in retaliation for a shooting that took place at my colleague's riding in Eglinton Lawrence a few weeks ago before that. And in that case, an innocent bystander was killed. The weapon used in that shooting belonged to someone who lived in the riding that I represent, the same neighborhood where this young man was shot. That person owned 11 handguns legally, and he ferried them around the city to different gang members to pay for his university education. And this situation is something which I'd like the opposite side to start to contemplate and provide some reflection for me on. It's a serious situation in the city that I represent, and real kids are losing their lives. In fact, the mother is a nurse at St. Michael's Hospital. She found out that her kid had been shot because he was wheeled into her emergency room while she was taking care of other people's children. This is a serious situation in Toronto, and I appreciate the long guns that the opposite member just talked about, the tools that are used to protect calves and that are used to get rid of foxes that are rabid and that are used to protect tree planters like my sister did. She has a long gun. She worked in the interior of BC for many, many years. I get that they're tools. But the question I have is this, is that you register your tractor, you register your car, you register your boat, you register the other tools of your hobbies and of your businesses. I don't understand why guns make you so upset. So.
Order. I have to ask the member to direct his comments to the chair. You is speaking of the speaker. And finish and wind up.
What's the problem with registering the guns? And then secondly, you say there isn't enough in this bill to deal with the
I think we better go to the honourable member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound. Thank you.
Speech.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and
You're done. You're done.
You had your chance.
to Mr. Speaker, to my honourable colleague across the way, and he is honourable, and it's a good question. And my condolences go out to the family. That's the kind of stuff that we all hate to hear about. It doesn't matter where it is. But respectfully, Mr. Speaker, I think the answer to his question is in part of the comment that he made, was that these 11 handguns were basically, if I heard him right, were basically sold to gang members. Is that not the case? Well, then I'd like to talk to him in private, because that was my understanding from listening. But they ended up in the hands. And again, respectfully, because the fact that young lives were lost here, and I feel very bad for that mother, that nurse. But this bill, I don't know what we have to do to get it, to make the honourable member and others like him understand that this bill does nothing to address the crime, like gang crimes and the illegal firearms sales. It does nothing. It only puts another burden on the people who already register and are, law-abiding firearms owners. I don't know how else to answer it.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
for not wrapping up quickly last time. It's an honest conversation here, because I think this bill does two things. I think it places a much more stringent background check on individuals, so that when somebody is acting in a way that is inappropriate, it's a deeper investigation as to why that person may be inappropriately holding guns or licensed. The second thing is the restrictions on moving guns around cities to make cities safer. And those are two things which I do think will make the communities that I represent safer. But I'll get back to the previous question, which is why is through the chair, could the other side please explain why registering all those other tools is acceptable, but guns somehow should be done differently?
Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Well, again, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I had a question in there that I guess I misunderstood his first response, and I thought he was going to stand up and clarify it, and he didn't. He wants to target on something that's already happening to law-abiding firearms owners. So, Mr. Speaker, tomorrow or the next day, I hope the member contacts me, because as a law-abiding firearms owner and a politician, a legislator like him, I would like to understand better the situation, and at that point, maybe we can have a good dialogue over it.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for